Daddy, can I hold your hand? Just once? The little girl's innocent question made the entire Central Park fall silent. Standing in front of her was Moretti, the most feared Mafia king in New York. A man who had spent his entire life making others beg for mercy. A man who had watched enemies fall without showing a single emotion. But at that moment, the impossible happened. The coldest man in the city looked down at a 3-year-old girl holding out her tiny hand and broke down in tears. No one understood why. Why would a Mafia king cry because of a little girl's simple request? Why did the little girl look at him like she had known him forever? And why did Moretti, the man who owned half of New York's underworld, whisper only one sentence? "I'm sorry I wasn't there." Because 3 years earlier, this little girl had been born into his life. And then he disappeared. Her mother raised her alone, believing the man she loved had abandoned them. But the truth was far more painful than anyone imagined. Murphy wasn't running away from his daughter. He was running away because he was dying. And he believed the only way to protect the two people he loved most was to leave them forever. Moretti sat at the head of the walnut table on the 42nd floor, his chest tightening with a familiar, silent agony. He was the most feared Mafia king on the entire East Coast, yet he could not command a single extra heartbeat from his own dying chest. At 38 years old, diagnosed with terminal familial heart failure, his private physician had given him a strict countdown of 5 years, maybe less. His dark gray eyes swept across the silent boardroom, where hardened capos trembled at his slightest nod. Vincent Russo stood quietly behind his chair, a scarred shadow guarding a man who was already falling apart from the inside. Murphy took a slow, shallow breath, tasting the metallic shadow of his inherited doom. Across the East River, in a cramped Sunset Park studio, another kind of quiet suffering unfolded in the dark. Allie Carter wiped down her kitchen counter at 3:00 a.m., her bones aching with the exhaustion of working 2 grueling jobs. She paused to look at her 3-year-old daughter, Lily, sleeping soundly under a pink lamp they called the moon. Lily had her father's striking blue-gray eyes Allie had spent 3 long years trying desperately to forget. Every night, Allie remembered the man she had known only as Al, the tired stranger who walked into her diner during a pouring rainstorm 3 years ago. He had made her laugh in the quiet hours before dawn, sharing a borrowed, fragile life before he vanished overnight with a single cold note. She never knew he was a criminal boss. She never knew the brutal world that had torn him away from her arms. Now she was just a mother doing everything she could to keep the little girl safe, feeding her honey toast with strawberries cut into tiny heart shapes every single morning. Neither of them knew that the distance between Manhattan and Brooklyn was about to shatter. In the penthouse, Murphy closed his eyes and let a single memory rise to the surface. The scent of rain, a warm laugh across a diner counter, and the girl he'd have loved enough to abandon. His phone sat silently on Mardma's side table beside his mother's antique porcelain espresso cup. The clock on the wall ticked downward, marking the seconds of an empire built on blood and a heart running out of time. Vincent shifted slightly behind his chair, breaking the silence with a low, gravelly whisper. "Boss, it is time." Murphy opened his eyes, the cold mask snapping back into place over his raw, bleeding soul. He stood up, walked the floor-to-ceiling glass, and pressed his palm against the freezing surface. Somewhere out there in the sleeping city, his daughter was breathing, growing up in a world he had forced himself to stay away from. He did not know that his private doctor had already scheduled a secret investigation. He did not know that the silence holding their lives together was about to crack wide open. The storm was coming, and no amount of power could stop the rain from falling. Vincent Russo stood in the shadows of a quiet Brooklyn park. 2 blocks away stood the peeling paint of Allie's apartment building. The night air tasted of wet autumn asphalt and old gasoline. He held a burner phone in his calloused hand. His eyes stared at the glowing blue screen. For 36 months, he had watched this exact building from unmarked sedans. He had logged every grocery trip. He had logged every pediatrician visit. He had logged every time the little girl with curly brown hair had tripped on the sidewalk. Orders from the top had been absolute. Protect them. Fund them. Never, under any circumstances, let them see a Moretti face. Now, the rules had changed. A dying king was running out of heartbeats. Vincent pressed the call button. Up on the 4th floor, a phone lit up in the dark kitchen. Allie stared at the screen. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. A known number. At 11:23 at night, nobody called with good news. She swiped the screen. She brought it to her ear. Her voice dropped into a defensive, trembling chill. "Hello? Miss Bennett." Vincent's voice cut through the line. It was low. It was flat. It carried the absolute weight of a man who never lied. "My name is Vincent Russo. I work for Moretti. I need you to listen very carefully." The phone slipped an inch in Allie's sweaty palm. The name hit her chest like a physical blow. She had seen that name on a television screen 3 years ago. It flashed beneath a grainy photograph of a man in a dark coat leaving a bloody crime scene. Suspected crime family boss. Her breath hitched. Her voice turned into a sharp, venomous hiss. "I don't know who you are. I don't know what you want. Whatever game you are playing, the answer is no. Leave us alone." Vincent did not raise his voice. He leaned against a cold park bench. He watched the lighted window on the 4th floor. "Ma'am, Mr. Moretti has known about your daughter for 3 years. A sharp metallic clatter echoed through the speaker. Allie dropped a plastic cup onto the linoleum floor. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. When she finally spoke, her voice shook. It shook with a fury that had been boiling beneath her skin for 36 months. "Then why did he never say anything? Why did he let me starve? Why did he let me work 2 jobs? Why did he let me lie to my child every single day? Why?" Vincent closed his eyes. He tasted the bitter ash of a loyalty that had cost too much. Because he believed his absence was the only gift he had left to give. "Ma'am." He knew about the daycare. He knew about the scholarship fund that paid your tuition. He had 2 men watching this building around the clock for 2.5 years. Not to hunt you. To make sure nobody else ever did. Allie's knees buckled. She slid down the kitchen cabinet until she hit the cold floor. She pulled her knees to her chest. Tears spilled over her lashes. They were hot. They were blinding. He watched us. He watched us suffer from the shadows like a goddamn ghost. "Ma'am," Vincent said softly. His thumb hovered over the disconnect button. "He doesn't have much time left. If you want answers, you need to go to Long Island tomorrow morning." The line went dead with a sharp click. Allie sat alone in the dark kitchen. The first gray light of dawn crept across the Brooklyn skyline. She held her phone tightly in her hand. She knew right then that her quiet, borrowed life was officially over. The night had kept a secret for 3 years. Now, the secret bled into the morning light. She looked toward the small bedroom where little Lily was still sleeping. The pink lamp cast a soft glow against the wall. Allie stood up on shaking legs. She walked into the hallway. Every board in the floor creaked under her weight. She touched the doorknob. Her fingers were cold. She opened the door just an inch. Lily turned her head on the small pillow. A stray curl of brown hair fell across her forehead. She looked so much like him. The realization struck Allie with renewed agony. For 3 years, she had blamed a ghost. Now, the ghost had a name. Moretti. The man who owned the dark corners of the city. The man who had held her in a warm apartment in the West Village while whispering promises he could never keep. She remembered the way his hands felt on her shoulders. Strong, calloused, unshakable. Yet he was breaking. Vincent's words echoed inside her skull again. He doesn't have much time left. Terminal. Dying. A mafia king with a broken heart and a ticking clock. Allie wiped the tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand. She walked back to the kitchen. She picked up the small wooden box her grandmother had given her. Inside sat the letter she had written 3 years ago, the letter she never mailed. The ink had faded slightly at the edges. Her fingers traced the folded paper. She slid it into her coat pocket. If he wanted answers, he would get them face to face. She would not hide anymore. She would not run anymore. Her daughter deserved to know the truth, even if the truth was forged in blood and shadow. She looked at the clock on the microwave. 6:15 a.m. The city was waking up. Car horns began to blare down on Fifth Avenue. The rumble of the early morning B63 bus vibrated through the floorboards. Allie walked over to the closet. She pulled out her coat. It was an old navy blue wool coat she had worn through 3 winters of snow and rain. She slipped her arms into the sleeves. She buttoned it up to her chin. Then she walked into Lily's room. She leaned down and kissed her daughter's forehead. Lily stirred softly, letting out a tiny sigh. "Mama?" the little girl murmured, her eyes still closed. "I'm right here, baby," Allie whispered, her voice cracking. "Go back to sleep. Mama has to go on a trip today." Lily nodded against the pillow, already drifting back into her dreams. Allie stood up straight. She walked out of the apartment. She locked the door behind her with a sharp, final turn of the key. She walked down the 4 flights of wooden stairs, her boots hitting each step with heavy resolution. When she stepped out onto the sidewalk, the cold October wind hit her face. She pulled her collar up. She walked toward the subway station without looking back. The tracks beneath her feet rumbled as the Manhattan-bound train roared out of the tunnel. She stepped inside. The doors closed behind her with a heavy mechanical thud. The journey to Long Island had begun, and nothing in their lives would ever be the same again. Miles away, in his midtown penthouse, Moretti stood by the window. He stared out at the gray horizon. His chest gave a sharp, familiar throb. He ignored the pain. He knew she received the call. He knew the machinery was finally moving. Vincent stood by the office door, his face impassive. "She is on her way, boss," Vincent said quietly. Murphy did not turn around. "Good," he replied, his voice like grinding stone. "Let her come. Let her see what is left of me." The taxi stopped outside the towering iron gates of the Long Island estate. Allie stepped out into the biting morning air. Her hands trembled inside the pockets of her wool coat. Vincent Russo was waiting by the entrance, his face like carved stone. He did not smile. He only nodded once, then pushed the heavy iron gate open. Allie walked down the long, silent stone hallway. The servants were completely dulling. The mansion felt like a cold, abandoned museum after hours. Vincent stopped in front of a heavy oak door. He turned his scarred face toward her. He is not the man you remember, man. He almost died last week. Coldest, just remember that. Allie did not answer. Her jaw was locked. Her eyes burned with a clear, consuming fire. She pushed the heavy wood door open with a single shove. Moretti sat in a leather armchair by the tall glass window. He wore a plain white shirt, with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. His left arm hung on the inside of black medical sling. He was far thinner than she remembered. His jawline was still rather sharp, but his stare carried a vast gray power. Silver threads outstretched his black hair untouched 2 years ago. His cold, blue eyes, which once silenced entire rows of 100 killers, looked completely holy. He rose slowly from the chair. His gut hand tipped the back of the leather that balanced. Allie, he whispered, using the bed when the way had ever been time. Just her there. Allie passed the massive room and legally steps. She did not pause to think. Her open palm struck the side of his face with every ounce of strength her body possessed. The sharp crack echoed off the marble floor and reverberated through the high ceiling. Allender's head whipped violently to the side. He did not lift a hand to defend himself. He did not flinch away from the blow. He simply turned his face back toward her, waiting as if he had deserved that exact strike for 3 agonizing years. Allie's entire body shook uncontrollably. 3 years, she whispered, her voice cracking into a ragged hiss. 3 years I starved myself so my baby could have milk. 3 years I worked 2 back-breaking jobs just to buy shoes that fit her growing feet. 3 years my daughter looked me in the eyes every single day and asked where her daddy was, and every single day I had to look into her face and lie. She drew a jagged breath. 3 years you knew. 3 years you sat in your glass tower and did nothing. Allender slowly lowered his gaze to the floor. His eyes were red, rimmed with a sorrow older than their separation. Allie, please, sit down. I will tell you everything. You need to listen before you judge. There was a strange, broken tone in his voice. It was not the commanding roar of a Mafia king. It was the desperate plea of a man who had never begged anyone for anything in his entire life. Allie dropped into the chair opposite him. Her chest heaved. Allender lowered himself back into his armchair, wincing slightly as his injured ribs protested. He took a slow, rattling breath. 3 years ago, the exact week Elena told me you were pregnant, she told me something else. He paused, his voice dropping to a fragile murmur. She told me about my heart. Allie stared at him, her brow furrowing in confusion. What are you talking about? Listen to me, Allender said, his eyes locking onto hers without blinking. After you left that note on my pillow, I searched for you for 6 days straight. Nothing. You vanished completely. I asked Elena to check medical databases. She found your chart at a clinic in Brooklyn. That was the exact same day she diagnosed me with stage 4 familial heart failure. The same genetic curse that killed my father at 45. The same curse that took my grandfather on a boat from Sicily. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. And I had a choice to make, Allie. I could come to you. I could tell you I loved you. I could tell you that our child might inherit a broken ticker. And I could drag you both straight into my brutal world. A world where enemies use wives as bargaining chips and children as leverage, where a black sedan outside your window is not a guardian, but a ticking bomb. Allie's lips parted, but no words came out. Or I could disappear, Allendore continued, his voice barely audible over the wind outside. I could give you a quiet life. I could let her grow up ordinary, safe, and entirely flee from my shadow. I chose the second option. I hired men to watch your building 24 hours a day, not to trap you, but to shield you from the wolves. I paid for your daycare so you wouldn't break your back entirely. I kept a file with every milestone of her life in my safe. He reached out slowly with his good hand, stopping just short of touching her knee. I was wrong, Allie. I know that now with every breath I have left. My absence wasn't a gift. It was a prison I built for us both. Allie covered her face with both hands. The hot tears she had held back for 3 long years finally broke through the dam. She wept silently, her shoulders shaking with a grief so deep it had no bottom. You took my right to choose a way, she whispered through her fingers. You made the choice for all of us. Allendore bowed his head, accepting the full weight of her condemnation. I know, he murmured softly, and I will accept whatever you decide now. Even if you banish me forever, I will not fight you. He lifted his eyes, staring at her with a naked, terrifying vulnerability. But if there is any chance at all, I may not have much time left. Please, let me meet my daughter. Just once. Only once. Allie stood up abruptly. She did not answer him. She did not look back at his broken form. She turned on her heel, walked out of the study, and slammed the heavy oak door behind her, leaving the King of New York alone in the dark. The train rattled along the tracks beneath the Brooklyn streets. Allie stared at the smudged window of the subway car. Her reflection looked tired. It looked broken. Yet underneath the exhaustion, a strange and terrifying peace began to take root. She walked up the 4 flights of stairs to her apartment. The door was unlocked. Her older sister, Emma, was waiting inside. Emma had driven down from Boston the moment she heard the incomplete fragments of the story. Emma sat at the tiny kitchen table. She did not offer empty comfort. She did not tell her everything would be fine. Instead, Emma looked straight into Allie's eyes and spoke the words that broke the final wall of her stubborn hesitation. Sar, that baby has a right to know her father, even if he is a damaged man. Even if it is only for one single afternoon, it is not your decision to make forever. It is only yours to make once. Allie stood by the counter. She did not say a word. She walked into the hallway. She stood outside Lily's bedroom door. She watched her daughter sleeping under the pink moon lamp. The blue-gray eyes fluttered behind soft eyelids. The small chin tilted slightly to the left, the exact same tilt Murphy used when he was lost in deep thought. The man was already woven into the fabric of their lives, whether Allie wanted him there or not. The next morning arrived with a pale, crisp autumn sun. Allie prepared breakfast at the small wooden table. 2 plates of honey toast, strawberries cut meticulously into small red hearts. She watched Lily eat the smallest strawberry first. She saved the biggest one for last, exactly as she did every single morning. Allie took a deep, trembling breath. "Baby," she whispered, her voice barely carrying across the table. "Mama needs to tell you something very important." Lily stopped chewing. She set the strawberry heart down on the edge of her plate. She looked up with an intense, serious gaze. The kind of gaze that belonged to a child who grew up too fast in a small apartment. "Your daddy," Allie continued, her fingers gripping the edge of the chair. "Your daddy is not far away anymore. He is here in this city, and he would love more than anything in the world to meet you, if you want to." Lily remained entirely quiet for a long, agonizing moment. She looked down at her strawberry hearts. She looked at the pink lamp on the counter. Then she raised her blue-gray eyes back to her mother. She asked a question in a voice so small, it pierced Allie's heart. "Mama, does Daddy like heart strawberries?" A sound escaped Allie's throat. It was half a laugh and half a sob. "I don't know, baby. I don't really know. Maybe you can ask him yourself." Lily nodded slowly. Her small head bobbed with absolute finality. She made a decision. "I want to meet him." That night, after Lily had finally drifted off to sleep, Allie picked up her phone. Her thumb hovered over the screen. She typed a single line to Vincent Russo. "Central Park. Saturday morning. 9 o'clock. The bench by Bethesda Fountain. Just him. No one else." Across the river in Manhattan, the message flashed on a burner phone. Vincent looked down at the screen. Then he looked across the penthouse study at Moretti. Murphy did not blink. He closed his eyes for 1 second. Then he gave a single heavy nod. Saturday morning came with a golden haze hanging low over New York City. The amber leaves crunched underfoot along the winding paths of Central Park. A thin mist drifted across the surface of Bethesda Fountain. A few stray ducks paddled lazily through the gray water. Murphy sat on a wooden bench. He had been there since 7:30 in the morning. An hour and a half early. He wore no expensive 3-piece suit. No custom armor cut to hide a holster. He wore a plain gray wool coat, soft old jeans, and simple brown leather shoes. Nothing about him looked like a Mafia king. Nothing about him whispered of violence or blood. He looked like any other exhausted father in Manhattan. A father waiting for a miracle he didn't deserve. In his good hand, he clutched a small brown paper bag. Inside the bag was a simple children's picture book about a family of ducks. He checked his watch for the 100th time. 8:57 a.m. 3 minutes left. His chest tightened. His breath hitched in his throat. Then, through the parting mist near the pathway, he saw them. Allie, walking in a long coat, her brown hair falling loose around her shoulders, and beside her, walking with small, steady steps, Lily. She wore a bright red coat, tiny white sneakers with gold stars on the sides, and one small hand tucked firmly into the corner of Allie's coat, just as Allie had written in the letter 3 years ago. Murphy did not stand up. He remembered Vincent's warning. Big movements scare small children, especially strangers. Just stay seated. Let her come to you. Let her decide. Allie stopped. 3 meters from the bench. She knelt down until her eyes were completely level with Lily's. She pointed a gentle finger toward the man sitting on the wood. "Baby," Allie whispered, her voice trembling in the crisp air. "That man sitting right over there, that is your daddy." Lily turned her head. She stared at the man in the gray coat. She looked past the gray hair, past the scars, past the heavy silence of an empire built on fear. A child does not see power. A child does not see money or crime or newspapers. A child sees a face. A child sees a pair of eyes reflecting a terrifying, absolute truth. Lily looked at Alejandro for 4 long seconds. Then she let go of her mother's coat. She stepped forward. She walked down the path toward the bench. Small, steady, unstoppable. Murphy stopped breathing entirely. The world around them dissolved into total silence. The joggers vanished. The ducks stopped swimming. There was only the sound of small footsteps growing closer. Lily stopped directly in front of the bench. She had to tilt her curly head all the way back to look up at his face. Her blue-gray eyes met his blue-gray eyes for the very first time in reality. And then, in a voice so quiet it barely disturbed the autumn air, she spoke. "Daddy, can I hold your hand? Just once." Lily stood directly in front of the park bench. She did not look away. Her blue-gray eyes locked onto his face. She had to tilt her head all the way back. Her small fingers twitched against her side. Murphy sat frozen in place. His chest burned with a sharp, heavy pain. He could not draw a proper breath. The entire world around them faded into nothingness. The distant traffic on Fifth Avenue vanished. The rustle of the amber leaves stopped completely. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Murphy stared down at the little girl. He saw the curls framing her face. He saw the exact curve of her nose. He saw his own blood breathing right in front of him. For 3 long years, he had convinced himself that staying away was an act of mercy. He had believed his absence was the only shield he could offer. Now, looking into her eyes, he knew that every single day of his sacrifice had been a slow, agonizing lie. Lily blinked once. Her small chest rose and fell under the bright red coat. Then she opened her mouth. Her voice was soft, clear, and utterly devastating. "Daddy, can I hold your hand? Just once?" The words hit Murphy as a physical bullet. They bypassed his brain. They bypassed his iron defense. They struck straight into the deepest, darkest corner of his broken soul. The dam broke. The man who controlled ports, casinos, and millions of dollars across the East Coast shattered into 1,000,000 pieces. Murphy did not try to hold it back. He did not try to look away. His shoulders dropped heavily forward. His breath escaped his lips in one long, jagged shudder. Hot, heavy tears spilled over his eyelashes. They streamed down his weathered cheeks, cutting dark tracks through the dust of years. He opened his right hand. His palm was calloused, scarred, and trembling violently. He held it out toward her. Lily did not hesitate for a single second. She stepped closer to the bench. She reached out with her tiny, soft fingers. She placed her hand directly inside his massive palm. Murphy closed his fingers around her small hand. He held her with a grip so fierce it terrified him, yet so gentle it felt like glass. A sob ripped from his throat. It was an ugly, broken sound. The sound of a man mourning 3 lost years. The sound of a man who realized he was finally alive. Lily tilted her head further, studying his weeping face with innocent curiosity. She did not pull her hand away. Instead, she offered her most serious expression. "Daddy, do you like heart strawberries?" Murphy let out a sound that was half a sob and half a wrecked laugh. He squeezed her tiny fingers. "Yeah," he managed, his voice thick and ruined. "Yeah, I think I do." "Good," Lily said, with absolute satisfaction. Without waiting for permission, she climbed up onto the wooden bench beside him. She scrambled over the old coat. She settled right next to his side, tucking herself against her ribs as if she had done it every single Saturday of her short life. 3 meters away, Allie stood frozen. Her hand was pressed tightly over her mouth. Her eyes were wide and swimming with hot tears. She had expected anger. She had expected cold words or awkward distance. She had never expected this. She watched the feared Mafia king weeping openly over a 3-year-old child. She watched the way his broad shoulders shook with every silent exhale. And for the first time in 36 months, the knot of resentment inside her chest began to loosen. The park around them slowly came back to life. A jogger ran past on the gravel path. A duck quaked near the edge of the fountain. The morning sun broke through the gray mist, casting a golden glow over the wooden bench. Murphy rested his cheek against the top of Lily's curly brown hair. He closed his eyes, inhaling the sweet scent of shampoo and sunshine. His heart throbbed against his ribs, beating a steady, renewed rhythm. It wasn't just once anymore. He knew that now. He would fight death itself to make sure he held that hand every single day for the rest of his life. The golden light of the autumn morning filtered through the dense branches of the ancient oaks overhead, casting long, fractured shadows across the stone pathway of Central Park. For a long time, neither adult spoke. There were no words adequate to bridge the chasm of 3 lost years. There was only the steady, rhythmic breathing of a child who had finally found the missing piece of her small world. Murphy kept his fingers locked around Lily's tiny hand, terrified that if he loosened his grip even a fraction, the morning mist would swallow her whole and leave him back in the dark silence of his Manhattan penthouse. His thumb brushed gently over the back of her soft knuckles, tracing the faint blue veins beneath her skin. He memorized the shape of her small fingers, the faint scent of strawberry soap lingering on her sleeves, and the quiet weight of her head resting against his chest. Allie slowly lowered her hand from her mouth. She took a step closer, her boots crunching softly on the amber gravel. She did not want to intrude upon this fragile, hard-won sanctuary, yet the gravity of the moment pulled her forward. Murphy lifted his gaze from the child in his lap. His eyes, red-rimmed and swollen from weeping, met Allie's across the short distance. There was no pride left in his expression. There was no cold authority, no intimidating facade of an East Coast kingpin. There was only a desperate, trembling gratitude that begged for nothing more than permission to breathe the same air. Allie swallowed hard, the lump in her throat aching with a dull, familiar pain. She stopped 2 steps away from the bench. Her voice, when it finally broke the silence, was barely more than a whisper. "She has your eyes, Mercy." The words slipped out before she could stop them. It was the first time she had used his real name instead of the borrowed moniker from the rainy nights at Rosie's diner. Murphy flinched slightly at the sound, his jaw tightening as another wave of unspooled emotion threatened to crack his composure. "I didn't deserve to see them, Allie," he murmured back, his voice thick and gravelly. "I didn't deserve any of this. You gave her life when I gave her a death sentence." "Don't." Allie shook her head, a single tear breaking free and tracing a clean path down her cheek. "Don't talk about death today. Please." Murphy gave a slow, solemn nod. He turned his attention back down to the little girl who had already grown distracted by a beetle crawling along the wooden slats of the bench. Lily poked the insect gently with her index finger, giggling softly to herself. "Papa, the bud has boots," she announced with absolute certainty, looking up at him with wide, serious eyes. Murphy let out a genuine low chuckle, a sound so rare and light that it seemed to startle even the pigeons resting on the grass nearby. "Yeah," he smiled, his heart swelling until it felt fit to burst through his ribs. "I think he does, Bug. I think he has very nice boots." Satisfied with this profound biological assessment, Lily leaned back against his coat and went back to watching the park unfold around them. Allie exhaled a long, shaky breath, the last remnants of her 3-year-old bitterness finally dissolving into the crisp morning air. She walked around the bench and sat down on the opposite end, leaving a respectful, healing distance between them. Neither of them mentioned the guards parked in unmarked sedans near the park entrance. Neither of them spoke of the terminal illness ticking away inside Murphy's chest like a hidden bomb. For this one single mortal, the world outside did not exist. There were no capos waiting for orders. There were no rival families sharpening their knives in the dark. There was only a mother, a father, and a little girl holding hands by the edge of the water. When the sun climbed higher into the sky, casting a warm afternoon glare across Bethesda Fountain, Murphy carefully stood up with Lily resting securely in his arms. He offered his free hand to Allie. The line connected on the second ring. "Rocco," Marco said, his voice dropping into a low, venomous hiss. "The king is distracted. He is spending his afternoons feeding ducks in the park." A harsh, gravelly laugh answered from the other end of the line. "And the girl?" Rocco's voice scraped through the speaker like broken glass. "Does she look like him?" "She has his eyes," Marco replied, staring out the window at the distant skyline of Brooklyn. "And if we take her, the great Murphy Moretti will come crawling on his knees." "Do it," Rocco ordered. "Tear the kingdom down to the studs." Marco hung up the phone. He smiled a thin, ugly smile. The trap was already laid. The bait was set. In a few short days, the quiet streets of Brooklyn would run red with blood, and the throne would finally have a new master. The afternoon sun over Brooklyn was pale and cold. A biting wind whipped down Fifth Avenue. Allie walked up to the daycare at 3:15 p.m., exactly as she did every single Thursday. Lily came running through the small wooden gate. Her red backpack bounced on her shoulders. In her tiny hands, she clutched a fresh finger painting. She told her mother it was a picture of Papa feeding the ducks. Allie smiled, kissing the top of her curly head. She took her warm, small hand. They started walking down the sidewalk toward home. Neither of them saw the black SUV idling against the curb 3 doors down. The windows were heavily tinted. The engine gave off a soft, muffled hum. Suddenly, 2 rear doors flew open at the exact same moment. 3 men in dark woolen coats stepped out onto the pavement. Allie froze in her tracks. Her fingers tightened instinctively around Lily's hand. She recognized the man stepping forward in the middle. Vincent Russo had shown her his photograph 3 weeks ago. Marco Bellini, the consigliere, the man who stood closest to the throne. Marco was smiling a warm, friendly smile. The kind of smile a man wears when he has practiced it his entire life. "Miss Bennet," Marco said, his voice smooth and entirely unthreatening. "My name is Marco. Alejandro sent me. There has been an emergency. I need to get you and the little one somewhere safe right now." Allie's stomach plummeted into an abyss of cold dread. Her instincts screamed at her to turn and run. She never got the chance. Before she could pull Lily behind her, the other 2 men were already at her back. A gloved hand clamped harshly over her mouth, stifling her scream. Another man reached down and hoisted Lily off the ground. He did it with such smooth, terrifying practice that the child barely had time to gasp. 30 seconds. That was all it took. 30 seconds, and the corner of Fifth Avenue was completely empty. The black SUV pulled away from the curb without a screech of tires. Inside the back row, Marco sat directly across from them. The warm smile was entirely gone. His face was calm, exhausted, and terrifyingly cold. "I am sorry for the way this had to happen, Miss Bennet," Marco said softly. "But this is business." Allie swallowed her bitter tears. Lily was pressed hard against her chest, trembling in silent terror. Allie forced her voice to remain as steady as iron. "You will not get away with this. Alejandro will find you." Marco let out a soft, gentle laugh. "Yes," he said, his eyes gleaming in the dim light of the vehicle. "That is exactly what I want." The SUV crossed the Verrazano Narrows Bridge under a shroud of gray clouds. Staten Island appeared in the distance. A long, desolate access road. A rusting, cavernous warehouse squatting right next to an abandoned shipping dock. The vehicle pulled through a sliding metal door. They were dragged out into the freezing gloom of the interior. A small back room with a heavy steel door served as their cell. A single wooden chair sat in the center, with a thick metal chain looped through its legs for Allie. A dirty, moth-eaten wool blanket was thrown onto the concrete floor for Lily. Above them, a single yellow light bulb rattled violently in its socket every time the wind off the bay slammed against the corrugated walls. Marco stood framed in the open doorway. He looked almost apologetic. 7 o'clock tonight, Marco said, checking his silver watch. "If Alejandro walks through the front of this building completely alone, no soldiers, no police, no Vincent Russo, then the 2 of you walk out of this room. If he does not, then you do not." Allie stared at him, her voice dropping into a low, venomous hiss. "He will kill you." Marco smiled a real, genuine smile. It was the ugliest thing she had ever witnessed on a human face. "No, Miss Bennet. I am going to kill him. And then I am going to sit in the chair he was never worthy of occupying." The heavy steel door clicked shut with a finality that echoed off the concrete. A thick deadbolt slid into place from the outside. Allie dropped to her knees on the cold floor. She pulled Lily into her arms, wrapping her entire body around her daughter. Lily was crying now, tiny and heartbreakingly quiet. "Mama, where is Papa?" Allie pressed her lips into her daughter's curly hair. She whispered the only promise she had left to give. "Papa's coming, baby. Papa's coming. Papa always comes." Outside the steel door, Marco lifted a secure satellite phone to his ear. He spoke in a low, careful hiss of Italian. "The trap is set. Have your men ready. By tonight, the Moretti family will have a new king." At that exact second, back in the Midtown penthouse, Alandra's desk phone rang. Unknown number. He did not need to answer to know who was on the other end. He picked up the receiver. Marco's voice came through, calm and dripping with simulated politeness. 7 o'clock, boss. I am sending you an address. You walk through the front door entirely alone. No backup. No, Vincent. If I see a single shadow following you, they die before you cross the threshold. Do you understand me, Alejandro? Alandra's voice was like grinding stones. I understand. The line went dead. Alejandro set the phone down with agonizing slowness. He turned his head toward Vincent Russo, standing by the door. His face was carved from granite. His eyes burned with a cold, terrifying fire. I will go alone. That is what he wants. Vincent's massive frame went rigid. His hands balled into tight fists. Boss, no. This is a suicide trap. He will put a bullet through your skull the second you step across that threshold. Alejandro raised one hand, silencing his most trusted enforcer. I will walk through the front door alone. That is what Marco expects to see. That is what he will watch. He paused, a dark, dangerous glint flashing in his gray-blue eyes. But you will not be behind me, Vincent. You will be underneath him. Vincent frowned, leaning forward. Alejandro walked over to the wall map behind his desk. He tapped a small blue line tracing beneath the Staten Island coastline. This warehouse is one of ours from 2010. I stored import crates there before we sold the deed. There is an old drainage tunnel running from the bay straight up underneath the floor of the main hall. It was cut for an old fishing operation. It is still there. It was never sealed. He turned back to face his enforcer. You take 10 men, not 11. 10 of our most loyal. No one who ever took a paycheck from Marco. You enter from the water. You come up through the tunnel while he is looking at me. While he is standing there wasting breath on a monologue, because Marco has always loved the sound of his own voice. You get Allie and Lily out first. You do not engage him until they are clear of the building. Do you understand me? First them, everything else burns after. Vincent nodded once, his jaw set hard. And you, boss? What happens to you in the middle of all this? Alejandro looked down at his own calloused hands. A long, heavy silence stretched across the office. I face him, Alejandro whispered. My daughter needs to know the truth. Someday, when she is old enough to understand, she will know her father was not a coward. Vincent did not argue again. The next 2 hours moved with the silent, deadly precision of a Swiss clock. 10 loyal soldiers were summoned one by one into the private office. No radios, no electronic traces, just handshakes, low voices, and an unshakable bond forged in decades of blood, a loyalty that $6 million in a Greek bank account could never buy. Alejandro slipped away into his private study for 10 minutes. He wrote a short letter by hand. 2 folded pages. He sealed the envelope with hot black wax. When Dr. Alana Maroney arrived at the penthouse at 6:15 p.m., he pressed the letter directly into her palm. If I do not come back tonight, you give this to Allie, he commanded, his voice unyielding. Only to Allie. In person. Alana did not ask what was inside. She simply nodded once, her eyes shining with unshed tears, and slipped the envelope into her coat pocket. At 6:45 p.m., Alejandro drove himself south towards Staten Island in a plain black sedan. His hands were steady on the steering wheel. No convoy followed him. no backup road in his blind spot. Deep beneath the freezing waters of the bay, 2 hours ahead of his arrival, Vincent Russo and 10 silent men were already waist-deep in dark seawater, moving stealthily toward the rusted iron underside of the warehouse floor. The stage was set. The blood was waiting to be spilled. The final reckoning had begun. The heavy metal door of the warehouse groaned open. Murphy Moretti stepped across the threshold. His hands were completely empty. No weapons, no armor, just a plain gray coat and the indomitable weight of a father walking into an execution chamber. Behind him, the massive steel door slammed shut with a final echoing clang. Inside, the air was freezing. It smelled thick of salt, rust, and old bilge water. A single row of dim yellow bulbs swung from the high ceiling on frayed wires. Long, jagged shadows stretched across the cracked concrete floor. Marco Bellini stood in the exact center of the hall. His arms were spread wide. His face wore a wide, triumphant grin. "Welcome, Alejandro," Marco called out, his voice echoing off the corrugated walls. "Come in. Your daughter has been waiting so patiently to see her father." Alejandro did not flinch. He walked slowly to the middle of the floor. He stopped precisely 3 meters away from the traitor. He did not draw his hidden pistol. He did not speak a word. Marco's grin tightened into something sharp and venomous. "For 15 years, you were the king," Marco hissed, his voice dropping the polite facade entirely. "For 15 years, I stood behind your chair. I managed the books. I cleaned up the blood. I built the European networks. And what did I get? I got to watch you trade an empire for a stray woman and a bastard child." Alejandro's voice was like grinding stones. "You were my brother," Marco hissed, his voice dropping the polite facade entirely. "For 15 years, I stood behind your chair. I managed the books. I cleaned up the blood. I built the European networks. And what did I get? I got to watch you trade an empire for a stray woman and a bastard child." Alejandro's voice was like grinding stones. "You were my brother, Marco. I trusted you with my life. I baptized your son." "Brother," Marco laughed, a harsh, cracking sound. "A king has no brothers. A king only has rivals. And tonight, the old king dies." Marco snapped his fingers. From the shadows around the perimeter, 8 armed gunmen stepped forward in a single motion. 8 black rifle barrels rose, aiming directly at Alejandro's chest. At that exact second, the ground beneath their feet trembled. A deep, violent rumble rolled up from the concrete. Then came the sharp hiss of escaping pressure. The heavy steel drainage grate in the middle of the floor flew straight up into the air. It hit an overhead iron beam with a deafening crash. Vincent Russo surged out of the dark hole first, soaking wet, pistol barking before his boots even hit the concrete. 10 loyal soldiers followed him out of the abyss, like ghosts rising from the grave. Glass shattered overhead as high windows burst outward. Bullets punched through the concrete walls in a storm of sparks and stone dust. 2 of the DeLucci gunmen dropped instantly before they could squeeze their triggers. Marco spun around in sheer panic, howling curses. He bolted toward the back room where Allie and little Lily were locked away. Alejandro moved with lightning speed. He drew his pistol from inside his coat in one clean sweep. A gunman trying to flank him dropped to the floor with a clean hole between his eyes. Alejandro sprinted after Marco, Vincent shouted across the chaos, pinning down the remaining shooters behind a stack of rusted import crates. "Get them out, boss. Take the tunnel. I have this side." Alejandro reached the steel door of the back room 2 steps behind Marco. He slammed his shoulder into the reinforced wood. The lock shattered in a spray of splinters. He forced the heavy door wide open. Allie looked up from the wooden chair, her face stained with tears. Lily saw him standing in the doorway and burst into desperate cries, stretching out her small arms. "Papa!" Alejandro crossed the small room in a single leap. He pulled a small pocket knife from his belt and sliced through the iron chain binding Allie in 3 frantic strokes. He scooped Lily off the wool blanket and shoved her securely onto Allie's hip. "Go," he yelled over the sound of gunfire echoing outside. "Take the tunnel straight to the bay." Allie shook her head wildly, terror ripping through her voice. "No, we aren't leaving without you." Alejandro pressed his palm against her shoulder, his eyes burning with absolute, desperate finality. "She needs you, Allie. If we all stay, nobody walks out of here. Go now." Allie looked into his gray blue eyes. She saw the reflection of an undying love that defied every law of the underworld. She gripped Lily tighter to her chest and ran toward Vincent waiting by the drainage hole. Alejandro turned back to the doorway. Marco had backed himself into the far corner of the warehouse. His face was ghostly pale, slick with cold sweat. His pistol was raised, trembling violently in his grip. "If I can't have the throne," Marco shrieked, his voice cracking into a madman's roar, "then you won't have anything left at all." Marco tracked his barrel past Alejandro. He aimed directly at the bright red coat of the little girl running toward the tunnel. Time froze. The roar of the gunfire faded into a distant hum. Alejandro saw the barrel align with his daughter's back. There was no thought. There was no hesitation. There was only pure, unadulterated instinct. He lunged forward with superhuman speed. He threw his entire body across the intervening space. He wrapped his arms around Lily and Allie, turning his own back to the gunman. He buried his chest against his daughter's curly hair, forming an impenetrable human shield. The gunshot cracked through the warehouse like a bolt of lightning. The bullet punched straight through Alejandro's back. It tore through his coat, shattered his shoulder blade, and buried itself deep in the center of his chest, inches away from the sick, struggling heart he had carried in secret for 3 long years. Alejandro did not fall. He kept standing. He kept holding his daughter against his ribs, refusing to let her feel the terrible impact of the world he was trying to save her from. Allie screamed. It was a sound devoid of language, a primal, agonizing shriek that only a mother could emit when watching the life of her child nearly snuffed out. Alejandro pressed his lips gently into Lily's hair. His voice was a weak, ragged whisper. "It's okay. Papa's here. Papa is always here." He lifted her carefully and handed her back into Allie's trembling arms. The front of his gray coat was rapidly turning a dark, ominous crimson. He turned around and faced the corner. Marco stood frozen, staring in absolute horror at the man who refused to drop. Alejandro raised his pistol with both hands. He pulled the trigger once. The bullet shattered Marco's knee. The traitor screamed, collapsing hard onto the concrete as his own weapon skittered across the floor out of reach. Alejandro walked forward, his boots stepping through pools of blood. He stood over the whimpering traitor, looking down with a deep, bottomless exhaustion. "You lost, Marco," Alejandro whispered. "Not because you lacked ambition. because you never understood what it means to be a man." He lowered his gun. He did not need to fire a second shot. The underworld would finish what he started. Alejandro turned his back on the broken man and took 2 steps forward. His knees buckled. The world spun into darkness. Vincent Russa caught him by the shoulders before his head hit the floor, lowering him gently into the blood-stained concrete. "Boss!" Vincent yelled into his radio, his face draining of all color. "Medical team to the bay exit, now!" Lily broke free from Allie's arms and crawled across the floor. She knelt beside her fallen father. She pressed her tiny, warm hand against his cold cheek. She whispered the words that had started it all. "Papa, can you hold Lily's hand? Just once?" Alejandro forced his heavy eyelids to flicker open one last time. He found her small fingers. He squeezed them with the last ounce of his fading soul. "Yeah, Bug. Every day. Forever." His eyes closed. His hand went slack. The sirens wailed in the distance, cutting through the freezing night as the ambulance raced toward the bay to pull a dying king back from the edge of the abyss. The private wing of the Long Island Medical Facility was dead silent. The digital monitor beside the bed ticked with a steady, rhythmic green line. Beep, beep, beep. Murphy Moretti opened his eyes under the pale winter light. His throat felt like it was coated in dry sand. His chest throbbed with a dull, heavy ache, but it was an ache of life, not of ending. Allie sat in the hard plastic chair right beside the mattress. Her hand rested flat against his forearm. She had not nuffed his side in 24 hours. Little Lily sat cross-legged on the edge of the bed. She held a thick piece of paper and a fresh box of crayons. She was working with absolute, furrowed brow concentration. "Papa?" Lily whispered, looking up through her brown curls. "Are you all right now?" Alejandro swallowed hard, offering her a weak, genuine smile. "Yeah, Bug. I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." Satisfied with the answer, Lily held up her drawing for inspection. It showed 3 stick figures standing in a row under a bright sun. A mama with brown hair, a little girl with curly hair, and a tall papa in the middle holding both of their hands. Only this time, drawn directly across the papa's chest, was a massive red heart, filled in with bold, unbroken crayon strokes. Whole. Safe. Allie. Alejandro reached out his heavy hand and stroked her hair. Dr. Elena Moroni stepped quietly into the room. Her silver clipboard ticked under her arm. She looked at the monitor. Then she looked down at the patient. "The bullet stopped 3 centimeters from your heart, Alejandro," Elena said, her voice carrying a rare, emotional tremble. "With your terminal condition, you should have died on that warehouse floor. You survived by miracle. And while we had you under, we installed the pacemaker." She paused, offering a faint professional smile. "Your life expectancy isn't 5 years anymore, boss. You have decades. Decades to watch her grow up." Alejandro looked across the bed at Allie. Tears welled in his gray-blue eyes, spilling silently down his cheeks. He didn't wipe them away. Allie slid off the chair, crawled onto the edge of the mattress, and pressed her forehead against his shoulder. "I forgive you," she whispered into the fabric of his hospital gown. "For the 3 years, for the blood, for all of it. Welcome home, Alejandro." 1 year later, the transition was complete. The black glass tower in Manhattan was dark, its walnut tables draped in white sheets. The Moretti Empire had ceased to exist as a criminal syndicate. Every port, every real estate holding, and every business front had been legally scrubbed and transferred to legitimate corporate entities under Vincent Russo's ironclad oversight. Vincent had stepped into his new role with the same quiet, ruthless efficiency he had always brought to the shadows. He never looked back. On a bright, crisp Saturday in April, a small chapel in Brooklyn Heights stood bathed in sunlight. White string lights were woven through the branches of 2 ancient oak trees in the rear garden. 30 guests sat on wooden benches. Elena, in a soft blue dress. Emma, who had flown down from Boston. Miss Delgado, smiling from the second row. And Vincent Russo, sitting quietly in the aisle, wearing the plainest suit he owned. The doors at the back of the chapel swung open. Allie stepped through in a simple, elegant white dress with long lace sleeves. Alejandro stood at the altar in a clean gray suit. No armor, no weapons. Just a man, waiting for his life to begin. Walking just ahead of the bride, scattering pink flower petals with an expression of profound, unmatched solemnity, was 4-year-old Lily. She wore a dress covered in tiny yellow daisies. She reached the altar. Instead of taking her designated seat in the front row, Lily stopped right between them. She looked up at Alejandro with her serious, blue-gray eyes. She didn't wait for the ceremony to finish. She didn't wait for instructions. She simply reached out her small hand and grabbed his finger. Alejandro looked down at her, his throat tightening with an overwhelming wave of grace. He knelt down on one knee so he was eye level with his daughter. "Just once, Lily," he asked softly, his voice thick with emotion. Lily shook her head with absolute, unshakable certainty. "No, Papa," she announced to the entire chapel. Every day. Forever. A collective breath got in the room. Vincent Russo turned his head toward the chapel wall, letting a single, hard-earned tear slip down his scarred cheek into his collar. Alejandro stood back up, holding his wife's hand on his right and his daughter's hand on his left. Together, they turned to face the altar. The past was buried in the dark waters of the bay. The future belonged to the light. And somewhere in the city, a foundation was quietly saving children's hearts, carrying forward a legacy born not of fear, but of an unbreakable, redeeming love.